All right, welcome everybody. We are going to be live here in a second as Scott joins us.
Hello.
Greetings, how are you?
Good man. How are you? Are we already starting? We're already in this.
Yeah, but my setup is kind of funky, so it kind of automatically goes live. But welcome. How you been, man?
Hello. Good, dude. Thanks for the invite. I'm honored to be speaking with everyone and speaking with you about this subject in particular. So,
Yeah, so as you guys know, we did a great interview over on Scott's channel maybe a couple months ago. I'll link that later because maybe some of the people in this audience didn't see it. But we had a great discussion on orthodoxy, nationalism, traditionalism,
yeah.
the connection of the people in the city to the country, the pros, the cons,
Mm.
and I've been catching up on a lot of Scott's content in the last couple weeks, and I noticed he's got all kinds of pretty wild breakdowns. Like your Tweed breakdown, bro, that was next level.
Yeah.
Like you went into the
Yeah.
depths of the metaphysics of Tweed, and I was kind of
Yeah.
blown away. It was really cool though. So what I'd
You
like to
liked
get,
it.
what I
That's
thought,
great.
what I suggested was, why don't we do a true history of the Anglo-Saxon people, the true history of Albion,
Mm.
and I thought maybe you'd be a good source for that. So first,
Mm.
for people on my channel that don't know about you, tell us about you, what your channel covers. I know you've done some really cool interviews with Pajot, with Paul Joseph Watson,
Mm.
and I was really honored to be on with you. So tell us about your channel, and then we're going to get into
Yeah.
Anglo-Saxon history.
Yeah. So what I essentially do is I try to get to the essence of the ethnos, I suppose you could call it. The in your hierarchy in the it's the thing underneath God, right? But it is a particular thing that's unique to a people, and I think it's a authentic essence that's been covered over with das Man, as Heidegger would say. It's been covered over with the inauthentic, this thing underneath that is what we have is our essence as a people, and it's just been sort of manipulated by the sort of propositions of the regime for so long, but it is still there underneath. What makes us a people, what makes us unique, and all peoples have this thing underneath, right? Their way of being that survives, I think, right? And so that's what I try to do. I break down these things, like you mentioned, the essence of Tweed, right? It seems like a simple thing on its outside. When you dig into it, people have just overlooked this thing, especially when it's connected to the folk, right? And that's the key, is that you just get a sense of these things. You follow an attunement, right? You go, there's something about this. And then you investigate and you do your real deep investigation of something and break it down, especially these, again, like I say, the folk customs, and you find that essence still there. And what I found is when I do that, when I break it down into its essence, people respond to it. When you say you take a Robin Hood tale from the ballads of Robin Hood, which are something that emerges and weren't written by any one author, right? So that means it's across all the people. It's being told in pubs. So it means it's distributed across the folk, right? So it's capturing something of folk being without the propagandization that you see with individual authors of history. When you break that down, and I use the methods that I use, people respond to it with such intensity that I didn't, well, I hoped it would do that, but I didn't expect it, right? It's like you align their propositional mind of themselves with their procedural knowing, as the cognitive scientists would call it, right? Because it's procedural knowledge, perspectival knowledge, participatory knowledge, right? And these things are sort of nested deeper levels of our being. And when you align those things, it seems to click for people. And I know, because you, like you would know with your comments on your videos, I know when something's hitting hard, something deep in people's being, because the response of the audience is just really so much more than describe it compared to say other videos that I might do. So that's the work. It's getting to the essence of it, to articulate it in new terminology. But even, I mean, look, you know, when people try to talk about values, the fundamental values of a culture, that's always an inept politician doing it, right? Or it's for their own purposes. But there really are those things underneath. And it's not that I'll ever be able to, or anyone can ever capture it totally in a proposition, but there are things in our being that are deep ways of being that need to be rearticulated. But yeah, I think that describes what I do. And I use the law, folklore, and mythos, but I also talk to distant people like yourself. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that getting on the connection between mythology and folklore. That's a great topic. Not many people really get into this at the level of depth that you do. And I was watching your Tweed video, and you're pulling out Kipling, you're pulling out folklore. I mean, it was great. And so that's a great introduction, to what you do on your channel. People are interested, and you've got tons and tons of interviews with individuals that I know my audience is familiar with, not just Paul Joseph Watson and Pajot, but I think you're going to have Nick Land on. A lot of the people in my audience would be familiar with him because he's done some research that influenced some friends of ours over at PsyOp Cinema, the guys that do a lot of movie breakdowns. They've analyzed his works a lot. So everybody check out Scott's channel for sure, and go ahead and subscribe to him. I do have his link in the show description. So let's get to the topic of today, which is true Anglo-Saxon history. I mean, how would you describe? Let's first maybe couch it. To what degree has this been kind of covered up with like Marxist revisions and cultural Marxist censorship, all this kind of stuff? Like, is there a true Albion that we can grasp for in the far reaches of history? How do you want to kick this off?
Well, absolutely, there is, and we sort of just touched on that by mythos as a good way of getting to the thing that's uncorrupted by the individuals who would seek to propagandize it based on their current propositional ideology, right? So because a mythos is not targeted by a particular person, it sort of emerges out of the folk. That's one way I try to get to it. But as you mentioned, there's been generations of it. There's the Marxist era where they corrupted it, where they corrupt with their fake histories, but also then we talk about the Whig history, which is sort of the base of that. So the Whig history that we need to overcome, and the people, I'm not the first to do it, but they take to be that there was always in history, in Anglo-Saxon history, that it was nested, that the parliamentary institutions of the Whig aristocrats were all deeply there, and that it could only evolve to their point until the custodian, the Whig aristocrats, would then nurture it into its natural point of democracy and progressivism. And this, so the way they did history, the Whig, you know this, I'm sure, the Whig historians did history, is it was all this progressive arc, right? And that history covered over much until there was some revision, right? So different figures have revised this history. One is Thomas Carlyle, again, who I'm sure you know. He takes the sort of great man of history way of overcoming that institutional progressive. So uses the great men as the turning points. Another one is David Starkey, who's a conservative, uses the monarchs to track the history to sort of overcome Whig history. What I want to do, or we'll try to do, because we only have a limited amount of time, is use the emergence of a hyper agent, let's call it, as a anchor for something, and we can call that Robin Hood or the yeoman as a higher order agent, right? An angel to anchor the emergence of something. Because I think that's the problem is that this history gets the Whigs use a false Anglo-Saxon mythos to see their history as if it was a ideal democratic election of the Witan. They try to use that as a Sorry, jump in.
Well, I've even heard a guy one time. I've even heard a guy one time trying to argue that Robin Hood is like a proto-Marxist story because he's stealing from the rich. I mean, I was like, what? This is Marxist. What are you talking
about? That's so ridiculous. And they do this, right? These revisionists. Robin Hood is a radically traditional force, right? This is the mistake of thinking he's some progressive figure, robbing from rich, giving to poor. When you go to the original ballads, it's none of that. He's taking false ties. He's attacking the middle managers in the name of the traditional hierarchical order, right? He's a liminal figure that allows for the man that's below that's outside of the hierarchy to form into these bonds of groups of men in their greenwoods to reform it, right? To reform it. So he's a liminal figure that emerges. And that's what I'll try and map, I guess, today, is that how that archetype, Jung, but you know what I mean, hyper agent angel emerges. Basically, what I call is the king spirit. And when you on the continent, they don't have what emerged here. They don't have on the continent. They sort of have the ancient regime and the plebs below it. But what happened in England is it allows for, again, this isn't a progressive thing. It's just the emergence of a form, right? The Platonists might say it's a form behind manifestation if you're a Platonist traditionalist, and it's just coming into fruition, let's say. But what happens is let's begin from the start. Talked about a few we've talked about a few Whig myths there. This idea that there was this ideal democracy, that the king didn't have ultimate power. None of that's true. The king was the top of the hierarchy. Anglo-Saxon society was a deeply nested hierarchy from top to bottom. There were the equivalent of knights. There were equivalent of all these things down to even the slaves at the bottom of it, right? So that's the first thing you need to do. And then the other thing is the absolutism. They try to say, oh, we're naturally progressing, taking the king's power away, which is just taking him out of the hierarchy, right? With the constitutional monarchy that they're trying to get to. Not true as well. You see, there's this deeply traditional strain in English life. You see this in the Cavaliers, the Restoration after the Glorious Revolution, bring back the king, right? When they tried to take his powers away. And look what's happened with this Whig narrative now, right? With this democratic narrative, it's a degenerated society, taken away natural hierarchy.
Right.
But it's not really part of, sorry, jump in, yeah.
No, go ahead. I'm disagreeing.
Oh, yeah. And naturally part of our hierarchy, right? And so what happens is some really unique things that happen in the history, though. There is a form of equality, not in terms of what's temporal, but in potential. So it begins really with Alfred the Great. When you see the invasions, the constant invasions from the days of England, you see what forms there is a response to that, which is the Berg system, the Berg defense system. So he does decentralize the Berg defense. He has every able-bodied man trained with weapons, right? And so for the first time, and you don't see this on the continent either, for the first time, every able-bodied man's training. He's given a decentralized system of defense. And you also have this idea that emerges of the Danelaw. The Danelaw is a region where the Danes rule. And then you have the English rule, right? And what emerges from that? So first you've got that, well, like I just mentioned, you've got that system of every man's training imitating the king, right? Decentralized. They have this sort of, what does that mean? They sort of have some of the propositions of the law in them, right? The way it being. And then you have the, what was I going to say? The Alfred the Great, and moving on to the, yes, so then we jump forward, right? We jump forward into the, so Robin Hood. We jump forward into, yeah, damn it, just jumped out of mind there. Sorry, Jay.
It's okay, no problem. I'll remind the audience too, if you guys would go ahead and like and share. We get a great conversation with Scott. Scott does a lot of talk on mythology and folklore, and rooted traditions that are organic and not co-opted and steered. If you would support the show via the Streamlabs function there, and yeah, I have a question. We can come back to where you were in the historical discourse there, but one thing that comes to mind is, we hear in America at least, we hear this story all the time that, the course of Western civilization, post-Roman Empire in the West is that Magna Carta happened. There was tyrants everywhere, and then Magna Carta is democracy. And then we get, religious wars and revolutions in the, post-Reformation period and all that. And then we get full-fledged democracy, right? Is that the overall Whig narrative that you're talking about?
More or less, yes. They sort of progress towards that. And the thing about Magna Carta is that's a propositionalization of something that's not as significant as people make it to be.
Yeah.
It's something that's written on the being of the people, if that is even the case, right? Because it's not about the people. That document has nothing to do with democracy. So yeah,
somebody said Robin Hood wrote the Magna Carta so that we could have gender equality, right?
That's right. And that's the thing. They're constantly warping this stuff. And you see, with the Robin Hood, it emerges in a far different way. As I said, it's a radically conservative narrative. It's a radically traditional narrative. And you see this with the king very early on, at the start of the 100 Years' War. So we're jumping forward a bit. You have, I'll mention the point about the Danelaw, right? The right and the Danelaw. On the continent, the Germans have the same word for right, which is Richt. And that's the same word as law, right? But what happens in England is it's a different word. Law means law, and right is something different, isn't it? It's something higher. It's religion.
Yeah, right.
It's God.
Right.
It's written on the Englishman's heart. So that's the actual constitution. And from out of that, what I mean by written on the heart, I mean, it can't ever truly be propositionalized, but this is the folk emergence element of it, though. And what spawns from this difference of right and law, which they don't have on the continent. Again, the Germans, it's the same word. The law is the right, right? Which means that you can have bureaucrats come up with laws that, oh, that's right. So no change of anything. But on England, you have this figure of the yeoman emerge where it's written on his heart, and he emerges in the 100 Years' War, like I mentioned. So every able-bodied man in England is ordered by the king to train with a longbow, right? It's everyone across the nation. And this, think about it, right to bear arms nested in this, right? Or deeply nested in the way of being.
Right.
This has not ever happened before. Think about cognition and how that works. How training once a week, they're ordered to train once a week with a longbow. What that does to people, to aim at something, to get better at something. And I think they're even ordered to teach their sons later on as well. So it's passing it down as well. And so because of the Black Plague, and because there's no professional army like on the continent, have men being recruited from across the country being ordered to come to the war. And these yeomen in the Battle of Crecy lay low the entire French ancient regime. These longbowmen, it's like 5-1 or something. I can't remember the exact odds. And they come back. So you've got constantly this 100 Years' War period. These Englishmen, regular yeomen, coming back with this skill set. They're out there imitating the king, and they're lifted into the hierarchy. This is what I meant by liminal figure earlier, right? This liminal emergence of this archetype. They're lifted into the hierarchy, and you see this when they're made gents. They're given coats of arms by the king, the heroes of it, right? So a way of being that was separate before on the continent, the ancient regime, you just had no way in. So this way, it's a liminal, you see this liminal space forming where the yeoman can go into the hierarchy, right? He's imitating the king over there. As we know, when we imitate it, that's how you sort of get the soul of the appearance. You think about Vola. Vola's talked about this with what made the Franks great was, and they didn't need top-down leadership because the lords had the soul of the Imperium within. This is this king spirit I'm talking about. So in England, the same thing occurred. Is that it's imitating in the 100 Years' War. They come back with that way of being, and yeah. So at the same time, you see emerging the Robin Hood narratives, the Robin Hood ballads, and in these ballads, it's a feedback loop where the liminal figure of Robin Hood meets the brilliant managers, the sort of merchants, low merchant classes, but in the name of the hierarchy, the name of the order. And this is across all of the ballads, right? And another battle that continues in that is the Battle of Agincourt. As we know, Shakespeare, Agincourt, again, the longbowmen lay them low, destroy them all in that period. And so there's laws constantly of the king, and this class emerges, this yeoman figure, which we see emerges, and it's really a liminal space where essentially what happens is every able-bodied man has this way of being in him, but it's in potential. It doesn't mean you are a yeoman. It's a liminal space archetype that people can inhabit virtues so they can enter the hierarchy. So you have both a temporal, and they're like an initiation figure, right? So you can have a spiritual initiation with Christianity, but that's a temporal initiation into the hierarchy, which didn't exist before.
Right.
So essentially, that's the archetype, but you see it mapped in these Robin Hood ballads, and and more evidence for this is in every village had plays, May Day plays, and Robin Hood takes over as the lead figure of all these plays that they would do every May Day, and the church paid for these plays, right? And so it was the king initially they do in these plays. And this is every village across England in this period, right? And so they all start doing it. And what do you do in a play? You imitate, right? And that's how you're seeing it transmit. This new figure rises as the villagers, villagers archetype or villagers angel, you could call it, right? So the function of this, you can see it's giving the hierarchy to everyone, but it's in potential. It's not something that is a quality. That it should be everyone's a yeoman. It's not everyone's a yeoman. It's about 14% of the population, right? So it's kind of equivalent to the Japanese who 10% were samurai, 14%, 10% were that warrior class, right? And so you see that emerge, and a lot of those people go to America, right? A lot of those people
This is
with this
fascinating.
way
I
of
didn't
being
know
is
any of this.
imperium.
No, this is all new to me.
All right,
I
well,
didn't,
perfect.
go ahead.
Well, what's so great about it? It's using that hermeneutic, it's using mythical figure, using a archetype to like
Yes.
Carlyle did with great men.
Right.
So it escapes that wig, and it really opens up all sorts of things. Everyone at home, when you look
Now,
at it this way,
when
you
said
jump in.
they go to America, what were you talking about?
Oh yeah, so that's what that's well, the yeoman, right? The yeoman's an important American thing. This whole everything I'm talking about now is really important to America. What happens is you have the hierarchy gets split up into different areas. So you've got the the Puritans leave from the West Coast and they go to New England. You've got the borderlanders like yourself. You've got ancestry in the Scots, you said, the Walter Scott and the
Yes.
Scott family. They go to that Appalachian region. You have the Cavaliers, which are the Cavaliers. Essentially, that's what Robin Hood is. He's a Cavalier. He's a radical traditional figure who's trying to restore the King's Order. They go to Virginia. And what happens is, because the hierarchy split up, you have this different parts of the hierarchy battling each other. You've got the middle class, essentially in Puritan, civil war, right? Cavaliers versus essentially Cavaliers versus progressives, Whigs.
Right.
And so when you split the hierarchy up, people both get the wrong idea. Because let's talk about Jefferson's yeoman for a moment. He takes the yeoman to be this ideal that he wants all Americans to be. We're going to be a nation of yeoman farmers. The thing is, though, because like we mentioned, the yeoman's a liminal figure in a hierarchy. It's in potential. If you take everyone to be that, you sort of you're sort of pulling apart the meaning-making apparatus, which is to enter the hierarchy, to become a gent, to be knighted, like Shakespeare paid for a coat of arms, to be a gent, right? To enter that hierarchy and story. And this happens in England too. It's not
so there's an element of
there's
an element of meritocracy involved that doesn't make it purely a sort of monetary merchant class thing that can be bought.
Yeah.
It's also not completely and totally based on heredity because there's elements of corruptibility with purely hereditary based status as well as monetary based status. So you have this, like you're pointing out, this sort of open door for the potential to step into this if you have the actual characteristics of what we would call nobility, right?
Well, that's how it's supposed to work. The hierarchy is supposed to sort people into their Brahmin category, into their, priestly or kingly or merchanty or this, right? But you make it stagnant when you just make it, it's just born into it. You need to have constantly into the hierarchy. Again, this isn't egalitarian.
Yes.
It's merely a matter of a unique system. It's a spectrum. It's temporal initiation. People just want a bit of initiation and they're happy with that. They just want to be, okay, I can just get to the next level. It's meaning making. So you have both the spiritual and temporal initiation. But what happened was it's pulled out and made egalitarian, or everyone's the same. There's nudity. Because what happened, we didn't see, I really love the Virginians. And because the Virginians are such a taboo because of slavery or whatever, let's just throw that to the side for a minute. We're just talking about a way of being, if that just didn't happen as a thing that happened, right? Slavery, whatever. We're going to forget that for a moment, just talk about our hierarchical way of being. They're so great because they realize this. They come over there and they have this, sort of hegemonic liberty is called by one American historian. But what they do is they dominate themselves. They see themselves as, and what that means by dominating yourself is to build up a virtue engine, right? And you shouldn't be equal to everyone else. It's about virtue. It's virtue based and merit based, right? And honor based. And that's what they understood down there. And that's what Robin Hood is too. When you think about it, the yeoman, when you get a piece of land, you get employees, right? You need a certain level of virtue to justify having a principality under you. When you have a certain virtue, that's what the yeoman is. There's a piece of land, perhaps he hires one employee to work on his farm or whatnot, but below that, you don't have the virtue engine yet. And so you see out of that is that, it's a democracy. Perhaps you shouldn't vote unless you have land. You want to have a certain level of virtue or national service before you vote. Just the random, look what's happened. Look what's happened. Every idiot. I think everyone should have the opportunity to do that, right? Through virtue or whatever, if you even have that as your system. But that's what happens. And Jefferson takes it to be this thing that applies to everyone, with just a small elite doing it at the top, but no hierarchy. There's no thing to ascend. Applies it to everyone, makes it this libertarian ideal. But the libertarian ideal really is aristocratic. It's really the people wanting it for themselves. It's saying, I've been disciplined. I've dominated myself with my virtue. I don't want anyone standing over. It's not really about the other person. That's what I think instinctually. At least that's how it started in Virginia, that libertarian ideal. So he lifts the yeoman out of the hierarchy and places him thinks that's going to be the ideal. He also thinks it's going to be, he gets that virtue from farming. But as we see, when you just take a yeoman out to the borderlands, out to the frontier where your ancestors are from, which is where the backlanders went in Kentucky, the Appalachian Mountains, you just take him on his own, it's sort of chaos, right? And it's you need, because that's the frontier thesis, that you take him to the frontier, but that's proven by the same guy that wrote Albion Seed. He said the Virginians into Middle America. So that it's not made by the frontier. When you take it out of the hierarchy, you're taking the king spirit out of the man. He's a king. He has the crown within. It's the potential to enter the hierarchy, right? The temporal hierarchy. That way of being is transmitted in the folk tradition, but in procedurally between father and son as they're born down, right? But that's the trouble. That you can see it in a bit of that Whig narrative, is that if we just teach people that they had blank slates, which is that liberal blank slate theory.
Laissez-faire, Enlightenment, John Locke, David Ricardo, David Hume, exactly.
Yeah, and so, I think and this isn't to lift up England above America or anything, right? It's just correcting certain Whig, which it's all of our fault. This problem is all of our fault, right? Because people like to blame Americans for it and attack them. Oh, it's just them. But there's seeds of this in Whig narratives. But I think what's so important about this to remember is the Anglo-Saxon has a deep traditional side to him, a deeply traditional. You see this in the Cavaliers. You see this in, I know this is a bit of a touchy issue, but in the Civil War, right? That was the Cavalier or whatever. But again, throw that slavery to the side and just talk about the Cavalier part of it. It's a Cavalier traditional order. And that's hidden under a taboo, under that Virginia thing, is actually another way, a non-progressive way that the Americans had in potential, and I think is still in American being deep down, this traditional way of being, and you're seeing it right now. Who are we, Jay? We are this Robin Hood, radically traditional. It's a radical movement, a reactionary movement towards that. That's part of us. That's what's fighting back. Other countries might not have that if it hadn't happened in theirs, right? So
I think
this figure is embodied in us. Sorry, jump on. Yep.
No, like it's funny because I recently went to DC to do a talk a few months ago, and I met Jim Jatras out there, who's a Greek Orthodox guy, and he's a kind of a long-time consultant, state embassy figure, and I went out there to do a talk, and he lives way outside of DC, where it's kind of traditional Virginia, and all the elements that you're talking about. When we were out there, it was so wild to see that element still being maintained out there in, I think, Alexandria, Virginia area, Leesburg, Leesville. I don't remember all the places we were, but I had so much traveling at that time that I got all mixed up. But anyway, and then about 45 minutes away, you go to the DC area, and it's just like the most gross, degenerate, just like awful, and it was during that time when I think Biden still had up all of these giant barricades and fences around the White House, like to give the impression that, oh, we're still under siege from all the the right wingers are there's how many years are we after this? We're still under siege, so leave the barricades. It's just all theater. But DC is horrible contrasted with you go 45 minutes outside of DC to traditional Virginia, and it still retains what you're talking about. The other thing it made me think of was in the South, we have it's the contrast between outside of DC, which is still the South, and then DC, which is nothing like the South at all. It's like California or New York, right? It's like LA or New York. And in the South where I live in Tennessee, it's still very much in the countryside, as we talked about last time. There's still a lot of these ideas of what you're talking about that are here still. They still are there, but they're kind of covered up, and there's this warfare, as with postmodernity and Marxism and all this and socialism. anyway, long story short is that I can remember the notion of coming out in society, right? That's a Southern culture thing that goes back to traditional Southern culture of the hierarchy that you're talking about. So, prominent ladies, they have a coming out party, and that kind of makes them a Southern belle. If you've watched Gone with the Wind, I think she's like a Southern belle. It's been many years since I've watched Gone with the Wind, but and if you've read Flannery O'Connor, or if you've read William Faulkner, the great Southern Gothic writers, they capture the ghost of this spirit of the traditionalism and the folklore that you're talking about that still resides buried to a degree in the South. And it's kind of what you would expect. I don't know if you've been to the U.S., but if you're in the U.S., like when you go to the big cities like Atlanta or Nashville is not that bad, although it's quickly becoming very bad. But the worst in the South by far is Atlanta. I mean, Atlanta. I mean, we went on a trip recently, had to drive through Atlanta, and driving through downtown Atlanta, and there's just giant rainbow crosswalks everywhere, and I'm like, is this the South? Where am I? This is what dystopia did I drive through in the South, right? Which I'm used to. I'm used to driving through the South since I was a kid. So it's just this contrast between, even in the South, you have just total degeneracy and dystopia and technocracy, and then you step 30 minutes even outside of Atlanta, and you find still a lot of wholesomeness, a lot of tradition, a lot of heritage. Anyway, I don't know. Those are the things that came to mind that when you're speaking.
I call that gaytheism, right? It's like that's sort of global American, well, GAE, as in it's just a
global American Empire.
Empire.
Exactly.
But it makes it sort of religious, right? Because it's their religion, and so they spread it. Their sort of Brahmin caste, which has taken over that coastal elite. So they've got their church, their media, who spreads it to all these places. And that's what we need to hold this stuff fast. You know, hold this stuff fast so it retains it, these deep traditions. I think it's important to remember that they're still nested for now in our procedural imitation, father to son, because they can't get to that so easily. Again, the blank slate theory we know is BS. So what does that mean? It means there's something nested underneath that we can still call to, that we can still integrate throughout our lives. That's what you're supposed to do, to understand your ancestors and your historical being. And then, of course, to religion. It's coming back to religion. What is that? What impels us to do it? Something from within impels us. Something that's a part of being that isn't part of the blank slate, that is calling us home. Something. Again, it's this oversoul. I think it's this. It's an angel. Again, it's not God, but it's an angel. It's calling a traditional angel that impels you and other people that have that in this way of being. And like I said earlier, we shouldn't characterize Anglo-Saxon as this liberal,
exactly.
revolutionary, because there's this natural side of him who is, and they come from Wessex. This is so interesting when you think about the Virginian. They come from the natural seat of English kings, Alfred the Great. That's literally where the Cavaliers come from. And so when you look at these Virginians, they're also borderlanders. It's the people that rebel against these Puritans are from Northumbria at the top, where your people are from, Jay, and Wessex, allied against the London elite and the Anglians, right, which went to Massachusetts. And you can see this in the election of Trump. Why did he get elected? It's the flyover states, because it's Appalachia. They migrated from the English-Scottish borderland, right, in Northern Ireland. And the mistake people make is thinking it's Celtic. Actually, Appalachia, the people that went to Ireland, they're from Northern Ireland. The majority of the migrants, they come from Northern Ireland, right? So when you say Scots, they're basically Anglos, right? And they have the same tradition and way of being across the Scottish and English border. I've got videos about that as well, right? So that's one thing. And so that's you can see in the voting pattern as well, that still remains. And I don't know for how long we can retain it for. Some people are very black pilled about this stuff, right? They say, well, it's over. The Brahmin, this coastal elite Brahmins have it. But you should, in the Anglo-Saxon way of being, this bleak heroic necessity is part of our way of being, right? It comes from the old Viking age. It's not the top of the hierarchy because that's God and hope and Christian values, right? But it's still there, nested. This idea that Tolkien talks about it. Bleak heroic necessity is it's fighting for its own sake. It's will in the face of impossible odds. Where over. You just know it's over. but you have this value just to fight anyway,
I know this is
right?
a
And
crude
so
analogy. I don't know what you would think about this, but I hadn't watched Braveheart in many, many years, and I know that's kind of a fictionalized story. But I think Mel Gibson was trying to capture what you're trying to say with the traditional Scottish genetics of like I'm not going to be your slave, right? And traditional Scotland had hierarchy with at the same time. What I liked about that movie is that it presents this balance between okay, you can have landed nobility and all this stuff and titles. It's not a problem. But if they are weak and a man amongst the people steps up and he has the kingly spirit that you're talking about, people are going to follow him. And it doesn't matter what names and titles you have. I like that element of the movie, which I never really noticed watching it. I don't know, I haven't seen it in probably 10 years, but and I know that's kind of a corny Hollywood thing. I don't know what your thought on that movie is, but rewatching it, I felt like, hey, this is like how long until the movie Braveheart's actually just going to be completely banned? I mean, like, there's nothing really, leftist or, you know, corrupting or corrosive that I could see in it in the last viewing. I thought it was pretty good. So. But anyway, long story short is, the other thing I was thinking about my family lineage too is kind of weird because I have this odd mix of, on the one hand, are you there? Did I lose you? Hello? I think Scott dropped. We had a bad connection, as you could tell that most of the time. So, Scott, if you want to sign back in.
Yeah, back. Sorry about that.
It's all right. We've had a bad connection, so maybe now it'll get a little better. It looks pretty solid now.
And I must have crossed over to.
I
think I must have crossed over to my mobile phone.
Oh.
Right. We're back though. I don't know. I just disconnected for a second there. But you were saying Braveheart.
Anyway, I don't know. I don't want to go too far afield. I know we're not talking about Hollywood today, but I just thought it was overall it was a decent message in terms of compared to the garbage that we typically see out of Hollywood today. No movie could ever be made like that again. And then the last thing I was going to say is that I have a weird lineage of, on the one hand, my mom's side, it's all traditional Scottish clan. It turns out Clan Maxwell, Clan Scott, and then that's why I put as the show picture today the Carleverlot Castle, which is owned by I guess Charles has this. So Charles, give me my castle back, by the way. And then
oh yeah, I don't get started about.
I don't think he's going to give me my castle back, but and then on my dad's side, it's the Dyers, which I found out in my 20s. I thought this was pretty funny that the Dyers in England are the actual swan uppers. So at some point we were given the licensure to raise the king and queen's swans. So I just thought that was funny.
Yeah.
So I have a weird mix of Brit and Scott.
Well, the thing about those Borderlanders is that they're very, again, like I said, they have the same culture, right? The Scots. In that Metaphysics of Tweed, Walter Scott wore the Borderlands shepherd's tweed, which is probably one of the first tweeds. The check. It looks like sort of a thing that what does it look like? Like a tea towel. Tea towels have that split of the difference, checkered pants. They are English, as much English as they are Scottish, right? So they share the same culture. And so when you talk about that, there is a confusion when people think, we're not the same. When it comes to the Borderlanders, they are the same as Northumbrians. The Northumbrians have a bagpipe. It's called the Northumbrian short pipe, right? So people like to put these divisions in. There is a big division between the Highlander, who is he's a Celt through and through, right? He's a Catholic. It's different. Whereas your ancestors were probably Presbyterian when it comes to that was the religion of the people that went from the Borderlands to the United States. But as for Braveheart, I think that's very Robin Hood, right? That is
exactly
to the hierarchy.
Exactly.
And actually, there's records of Robin Hood being told in Robert the Bruce's castle, right? They told that Robin Hood story. So this is a cross-border thing.
Oh, wow. Well, you know what? I just realized that there's actually a scene in the film where at one point, Mel Gibson and his team and his crew, they're basically hiding out in the woods like Robin Hood. So that there probably is kind of a conscious or unconscious sort of throw reference to that.
I think it comes out of the way of being, right? It comes out of the very priors that are just nested, not prepositionally, not in speech, but just deeply nested in the being of the people on the Borderlands. And because Robin Hood is basically Yorkshire, it's pretty far north, right? Barnesdale is where all the legends took place, and they're told in courts, right? So we know it's both a thing of the people and also a thing of the aristocracy as well. It's in Henry's court. They did Robin Hood plays. So something that was just there were some priests that didn't like it. They were saying, "Oh, this is very," but they all paid for it. They paid for plays for it. We got the records of people paying for it, right? We can't stop it, and so they'd act out. But yeah, I think it really calls to a. The trouble is, it just gets so propagandized by these bloody communists saying, "Oh, it's revolutionary." It's never been revolutionary. It is a restoring of traditional order because it's written on the hearts of every man. And he says, the sheriff of Nottingham is an archetype of the state, the grubby bureaucrat that have taken over all our power structures, right? This grubby bureaucrat and foreigners, right? This sort of foreign ideas that are not part of the way of being in the place, which has happened. And what do they do? They want to lift immigration because they want to destroy the vote of the people that have that traditional order within. I'm not saying you can't get this soul, this metaphysical soul, right? I'm not saying that can't happen, but that's what they want to do, break down that well, they have essentially in many ways. So we need to sort of call to it, and it's part of our deeply nested in our value structure. That radically traditional way of being is still nested in Anglo-Saxon being, is still nested in America, or you could just call it historical American. It's still deeply nested down there that we can call to. Right.
Well, and that's precisely why they hate the quote flyover country so much, is because it's exactly rooted in what you're talking about, and that's really the only thing that potentially poses a danger to this homogenized technocratic anti-family kind of agenda. So that's why they hate it so much.
They're acting like the revolution never ended, right? When they've won, they pretend as if they are the many people have said this, I'm sure, right? They are the counterculture. It's a false counterculture. We are the counterculture. This response is the thing that's risky. What they've been doing, they are the rulers. We know they're the new aristocracy, all right? But they have all the degenerate values that will just sort of destroy the whole place. And I think what we need to learn is that we do need a uniform way of being across things. I think this sort of pluralism has destroyed us. I don't want to say anything that's too outlandish on your channel, but Japan look what happens. Have you seen videos of Japan recently? My God, some guy falls over and 50 people come around him. This is at the train station, right? 50 people go, "Oh, are you okay?" and lift him, give his thing. What happens in New York? A good Samaritan stops someone. I don't know whether I should talk about this, but a good Samaritan stops a psychopath and he's suddenly arrested, right? So what's going on? That's what happens when you have a million different cultural things together fighting each other.
Yeah, it's complete insanity. It doesn't make any sense. It's ultimately it's destructive. It's not just a result of bad policies and all that. It's more of a malicious, cold-hearted agenda that's manipulating all the parties involved, but it does have a long-term destructive end game. Now, we got a couple super chats, and then we'll get back to the conversation. Athanasia for $5. Jay, what are your thoughts on aliens and Gaia? Are they misleading people? I never believed in aliens. I never supported that. My TV show aired on Gaia, so I had no say-so over what Gaia did or anything like that. It was my TV show was with Jay Wiedner's company, and then it was able to air it on Gaia, so I was never an employee of Gaia. Meta Ninja's $10. I want to insert my 2000 IQ comment and donation. Is that the 2000 IQ comment, or is there another one coming? Because that's all you said, but I'll take your $10. Thank you, Meta Ninjas. Kristen, $5. Jay, this is a great discussion. I love Scott, and he is suppressed and throttled like so many other channels. He really deserves more subs. Yeah, exactly. Good channels putting out good content absolutely get throttled. We know we get throttled over here. So I'll put in the show chat for you guys right here, Scott's channel. So be sure and subscribe to him and go check out all these other really in-depth interviews and analyses that he's done. Rockmashu, $10. This is a kind of an iffy one. I don't know if I can. Let me think how to speak in YouTube code to read this super chat. Yeah. I saw a Ralph child estate seized by tiny mustache men. How do we reconcile with this the idea that they were behind Tiny Mustache Men? Okay, so it's not. It doesn't work, like a top-down thing where it's like everything that an elite person. I mean, it's like the bombing of England, right? I mean, there's a lot of English businesses that were bombed in World War II that was a decision made by higher level people and banking elites that didn't have any concern for those British families or businesses. So it's kind of like they asking the question, like, why would anyone, do a fake flag event, right? And the answer is that you can always have a gambit. And so, one estate being occupied for some, amount of time is not a big deal. So it's not like Ralph Child was literally controlling what Tiny Mustache Man did at every point. It was that there was funding put into different World War II powers on the part of the West. They funded Bolsheviks, and they funded Allies, and they funded Axis powers, and that's because they were also wanting to hedge their bets. So it's a lot more complex than just thinking of it like, everything's a perfect top-down control system. I don't think it really works that way. But I had a question for you, Scott, because obviously the big thing in the news in regard to the UK in the last month or so is the coronation. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that event, what you think of the royal family, to what degree you want to get into any of that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, please. Yeah. Well, I've got an essay that is called Nation as Hyperorganism and Distributed Cognition, which really penetrates again into the tradition, but from the perspective of a hyperagent, from a perspective of an organism that has existed deep in being, that's been exploited, that's been attacked, right? And even has at the end of it, I speak as a dialogue exercise, right? So check that out in terms of what I'm about to say, which about the coronation, is that these traditions, this stuff, the funeral, all of it, they are the organism. They are a traditional organism in historical being, and historical being we possess. It's not something that's past. It's something as an extension of our being as a people, of the ethnos. It's an extension of us, right? These lived traditions, same as the Orthodox Church. They are an organism. As we know, the body of Christ is the church, right? This is not a fiction or something. It literally is. So when we look to these traditions, these kingly traditions, these coronations, they are part of the organism that lives every time a king does. The king is immortal. It's this angel. It's immortal, right? It lives on and goes again and again and again. So what happens is when you have some degenerate king or someone disobey the actual historical ceremony, as you know from Byzantium, these things are very old, right? And there's certain ethnic elements that are in it. I was just very, it was a deep disgrace in terms of the multi-religiousness nature of it. I was planning a live broadcast of this man, and it's disgusting, despicable. Some people have been nice about this. Oh, at least they did it. No, it's despicable. It's a deep wound that's been clawed in the English people by what they've done here, right? They didn't mention England once in the whole ceremony, even when the ring was presented.
Like, what was there really that was English about it, right?
Nothing. They did the ring of England is the ring of England, and they gave it to him. He didn't even mention it. And it's this degenerate head of the Church of England, for one. Peter Hitchens sort of mentioned, oh, Charles is a bit of a traditionalist. It seemed to be the Church of England didn't allow him to do it, but this guy's got the royal prerogative. He can actually, as Curtis Yarzen talks about, him and his son could take over and use the law and actually have a Beijing restoration if they wanted to. They just don't have the will to do it because they've been corrupted by this. Maybe he had a tendency to have this traditional thing, but this perennialism, so degenerate, has obviously infected him. So it's not just about the Church of England. He's actually allowed the multi-religious element. And there was this disgraceful, they brought in, sorry to the people that do gospel choirs, they had this gospel choir thing. It was such a woke thing, diversity thing, where they brought them to the front of the ceremony. I don't know if you watched it. And out of anyone, the choir is supposed to be seated back. That's the choir is. And they're doing this ass gyration movement in the middle of a traditional ceremony.
Wait, so you're saying that you don't like the idea of a traditional choir twerk? I don't get it.
Yeah, that's right.
What
Right?
if it was a
I
tradition?
yelled at the screen. I
What if
said,
it's
"What the f is this?" Right?
it's
It was just
traditional
what?
twerk. So what are you talking about? It's traditional twerk.
Yeah, yeah. What am I must be.
It's not
What,
this
what's
new
wrong with
radical
me?
progressive twerk that they're doing on TikTok. This is for trad twerk.
Yeah, can we have like Miley Cyrus on stage to do a traditional twerk or whatever, or some like gay theism regime, oh, whatever degeneracy that this. Because think about it like two organisms. One organism is this gay theism, this global American empirism, because it's a religion, whatever that has connotations of other things too, right? Gay theism, whatever, GAE theism,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
that's an
exactly.
organism. It's attacking. Um, it's attacking the traditional organism, which is this English. Sorry, music just started playing in my ear because I pressed the button on my ear. But yes, the traditional organism, which is the extension of our being, which is the ceremony. Luckily, they didn't have time with the funeral to do that because it's so sudden, right? They did a bits and pieces, some things, but you get a sense of its attunement when you're watching a ceremony that of this organism, this traditional organism. And you saw that constantly in the funeral. You could watch it without the disgusting BBC commentary, where they're constantly chiming in, ruining it by saying things. You don't have that in an Orthodox ceremony, do you? You go to church, there's no stupid commentator that comes in and ruins it. So in the funeral, I had that
The
several
play by
times.
play.
Yeah, the play by play. That's right. And so think about it. That's what they do, isn't it, with news stories?
That's a good
That's what
point.
the news media do.
It's a
You get
very
events.
like, well, first of all, it draws away from the solemnity of what is supposed to be because play by play is like a sports thing. Why would we have a play by play in a quasi religious ceremony? It's just preposterous.
Yeah, and so there were moments because they had this separate channel, and in some ways, thank God for the internet. I know we talked about this last time. There's good things and bad things about the internet, but they had this separate channel that had no commentary that I watched for the funeral. And there were moments, man, that are captured in that essay I wrote where the sun shined into the thing that he was holding, and it just boof, was this giant spark of light, and just the silence, dwelling with the silence of some moments in the ceremonies, right? You see this, you just get a sense of the attunement of whatever it is, God's there. And I articulated that it was calling to him to say, be, traditional. It's the King Spirit saying, lift me up. Is what he's supposed to do. He isn't the king. He's supposed to wear the king. That's what all the sacred symbols are about. It's you use the sacred symbols to articulate the way of being that you are supposed to do. You're supposed to lift yourself up to this and embody it. People say they're the ideal. They're not the ideal. They're supposed to embody the ideal from this hyper agent, an angel. They're supposed to be a bridge to God. The Celts have this old saying back to Arthurian mythos where the king is the bridge. It's very old, right? And that connects with the Orthodox. The king is the icon of God, right? It's the bridge.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the Roman emperor too. I mean, Pontifex Maximus is the bridge.
Yeah, so it's very old, right? And that Arthurian legend is connected to Alter Imperium, which is this, it's this idea of England being an imperium, a traditional imperium. When the degenerate Rome degenerated, that was the sort of mythos embedded in the mythos.
Right.
That's all very important stuff. And what an opportunity to have a magical, real connection with the transcendent. And I don't know if you've ever watched the Elizabeth one, where they really shot on. There's a 4K scan of it on YouTube, and they shot on telly. What's it called again? That old film, but color film. And it's just pooled light. It's everyone's wearing their traditional garb, their coronets, right? And these things matter when you wear this ceremony, these rituals. Again, it's part of the being of this actual organism. And so when the king was crowned in this one, you just had all these idiots in the background in their stupid normal costumes, right? And you're thinking, what is this profanity? It just destroys the ceremony. But when you look to the Elizabeth one, the king's crowned, and all the lords in their robes and the ladies in they've got these sort of almost Greek tiaras, a Roman sort of, what's it called again? The laurels. They're wearing these laurels. They look magic, so demigods, or not gods, but they just look like angels essentially. Yeah. And when he puts the crown on, everyone behind him puts a coronet on. They got rid of all that. So there were probably two moments where I sensed there was this the organism. It was when he was wore the Supertonica. That's the real Byzantine stuff. And you just felt it. You just felt it. Okay, that's one bit. It's sort of two moments, right? That Supertonica, which is it's the sort of golden robe you saw him in, and they put the mantle on. but then it was one moment, and then it's just sort of ruined by all this other stuff they connect to it. There's another moment right at the end where the whole military, because we have to remember the king's a warrior, the whole military was at the back of Buckingham Palace. Every unit of the British military, all these Englishmen were there, right, waiting. And the shot cuts there, and it's just waiting in silence for the king to arrive. And what I thought at that moment, I thought, these men are waiting for a true king. They want a true leader. And what have they got? Right? And so he turns up, Charles turns up, and they do their 3 cheers for His Majesty the King, hip, hip, hooray, right? But this is like tens of thousands of people yelling it. And then you realize what it's really supposed to be. This king is supposed to be the head of the military. He's supposed to be a true king, and he could be, but he won't.
Yeah.
And so either we need an Arthur to take over, to somehow take the kingship somehow, right? Because I'm a reactionary in that way. I think we need a king or a Caesar to rise up to. That's what the mythos says. King Arthur narrative in the mythos. Arthur rises, right? He fixes the whole system, and then he goes again. So perhaps a democracy or whatever can be restored at some time. But for the moment, we need a king. We need a real king.
Well, I've often wondered if there. I mean, I don't want to go too far with this. I'm not being literal, but Tolkien's Return of the King is about this idea of a future, return of true monarchy. So I don't know how that would happen or what would happen, but it does seem like there is this yearning that manifests itself in literary quasi-prophetic writings. And we know, for example, I've made this argument many times, in Dostoevsky's writings for the Spirit of the Russian People, he wrote prophetic things. He wrote predicting the mountain of 60 million skulls, 100 million skulls in his book Demons, which predicts way ahead of time what the socialist revolutionaries would do. Other writings that Dostoevsky has too are very prophetic, like Notes from the Underground predicting technocracy. So I think in the same way we can look to these traditional English writers like Tolkien and Lewis, who Lewis in the Third Space Trilogy has Merlin come back, and Merlin's yearning for the king. He keeps saying, where is the king of England that can help us fight these people? And they're trying to explain to him, everything's really weird, and Gatheism rules, and it's like that we can't. There's not one. Just trust us. It's not going to help, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the funny thing, is that the artist sees something, because as Carlyle says, the artist, the poet, Shakespeare, these are the guys that used to be prophets, but in our age, they're not prophets anymore, right? But they still have that attunement, that way of seeing, and they've seen stuff. And again, look at C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. These guys are deeply traditional. Here's that Anglo-Saxon streak, that cavalier spirit, right? Talking to it. And think about it, Return of the King. This is not trivial. These people think, it's just a story. No, he was deeply involved in Anglo-Saxon being Tolkien. He lived next to an Anglo-Saxon church. He's all these characters are so absorbed from these mythological contents, which is what we said earlier in the conversation, is that they are a uncorrupted capture of being. Right. So it's so important that he's absorbed it. But think about this: Strider from Lord of the Rings, Ranger, Robin Hood, right? Anyone?
Oh yeah, Ranger, exactly.
Ranger, right? Who is from
Great point.
Does Denethor say? Lowborn, whatever. But he has
a true king spirit, and he's in tune with the land because he can track like no one else. Yeah.
Exactly. He's been with the land itself. But what it means is that it could come from anyone. People say, it has to. This tendency in the Robin Hood narrative to say, it has to be a noble birth. What that means is that everyone has the king spirit within. That's what really that means, right? Because we see in the Robin Hood narratives, it's always a yeoman. It's only later that they make him an aristocrat proper, but he is an aristocrat of the soul because the king spirit has been passed to him. And as again, Evola says, we want to be aristocrats of the soul, right? This imperium's within. But think about that, Strider. He has this noble spirit. It's from an ancient line. And that's true of the Anglo-Saxon as well, because the Normans came along, right? So there's this old deep line. We're all ancestors of these kings. If you go far enough back, and we're all of that ethnic line. But yeah, if you think about it, what that Return of the King is a mix of Arthur and Robin Hood. And those things are actually connected in English being. They're not just stories. They are the expression, the external press of something that's behind manifestation, or something that is the unconscious. Sorry to use the unconscious because Jung. I know you don't like Jung, but there is
No, I think that Jung has a lot of insights because of kind of overlaps with Neoplatonism, but
yeah.
I'm reserved about the Gnostic extremes that he went to. So I like
Yes.
and dislike Jung. I don't just dislike him.
Oh, great. Because I often wondered that. I wanted to ask you in the interview. I never did because I'm a big fan of his understanding of that and those Neoplatonic things. And he actually was a Neoplatonist in the sense of when he's talking about the unconscious, talking about empiricism. He's really a Platonist. He even says it.
Yeah, right.
He's talking about daemons or whatever, not to use daemons. Let's just say angels, right? For the sake of purposes of. But yes, these things are deeply connected that are in being, and Tolkien's recognized that. And so there is this what I've mapped in the ballads of Robin Hood and connecting them to Arthur is this sort of cyclical thing where in the ballads you see Robin Hood does his duty for the kingdom. The king brings him in and reincorporates him into the kingdom in these ballads. Again, these ballads weren't written by one author. They're from out of being itself, told in pubs, transmitted in that way, reflects deep truth on the ground for that reason.
By the
Right.
way,
So
somebody brought this up in the chat, and it just occurred to me. I want to ask you: is that the source of the idea of pulling the sword from the stone? That it's not a special lineage per se, but it's whoever is inherently has the kingly spirit. Is that the meaning of that?
yeah, I mean the stone, it's a cut stone, I suppose you could call it. The sword pulled from the stone. It's an initiation because initiation, you're pulling a sword. A sword is a pointy tool. The pointy tool is the thing of order. The sword and the stone is the lost order, isn't it? It's the order that's been lost in the kingdom. So it's put in the
Oh, great
stone. It's
point. Yeah,
waiting for the
exactly.
man to restore the order. So you pull the
Yeah.
pointy tool. This is very old symbolism. You know it all. You've talked about this. You've had programs on this. Is old symbolism. The stone also is the Grail, right? There's that black stone is the
Yeah.
Grail, right? That's initiation too. The Grail is a where the principle is stored. The blood that's in the Grail is the principle. The Grail is the cave. It's the cave of initiation. You know that, right? It's the in symbolism because that's what the liquid is, isn't it? That's Christ's blood. That's the principle that you're drinking when you're looking for the Grail. You're looking for Christ. You're looking for the principle. Um, in terms of
No,
the
I've
divine
read a
principle.
decent amount on Grail lore. It's not something that I had a grad class where we went into the Crescent de Troy and the all these some of these Grail, but this was like 15 years ago, so a lot of this stuff I don't remember. And I'm familiar with a lot of associations with the Grail and certain ideas, but what is the connection between cave and Grail? That I don't know.
Well, it's the shape of it. It's the Grail is the heart too. It's the
Oh, okay,
center. It's
okay,
the
I see. Yeah,
center.
yeah, okay.
So when you go into the cave, you're initiating going down, or and in the cave, in the middle of the cave is the principle. That's the idea in symbolism.
Oh, okay,
Same as the
gotcha.
Grail. That's why it's got that round shape. Triangles are like that.
I
There's
got
a
you.
bit of
Okay.
Gwenon here. I know Gwenon's perennialist, but he was
Yeah, I
very
mean,
good
I've
on the
still read
symbolism.
these people, and I find insights in Evola and Ganon, all these people. Absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to always caveat it with that because I know people might get annoyed in the comments
Yeah,
when I
they'll think
mention
you're. Oh,
those
he's
things.
promoting. Yeah, I know. I understand.
He's Gnostic.
Yeah, right.
Right? But yeah, that's what that means. It's what are they? And think about it. What are the knights after when they're going after the Grail? What is the very thing that they're doing? It's initiation. They're looking for. What are they really looking for? They're looking for the thing that's in the Grail. It's the blood of Christ, right? And what is the blood of Christ? It is Christ. They're looking to become Christ. It's an ascetic initiation, a warrior initiation, but that's what it is. And Avola makes other connections with that, but it's that
I see.
Grail is
I
connected to the
got you.
celestial stone, which is a black stone that comes from the gods. But anyway, it's connected to the heart. The heart has the same sort of symbol. That's the center of life. The center of life is a principle, the center of everything, right? The heart's the center of the body as a microcosm.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's what the Grail is. I think it actually comes out of Celtic lore as well. It started as a cauldron, um, but yeah, that's what they take that to mean, and that's why they go on the quest. It's an
Okay.
initiation quest, a temporal initiation, but also a spiritual initiation at the same time to ascend, I suppose. And what they really are, what Arthur really is, and what Gawain and all these knights are, is they're an extension, an ethnic extension of the king. So when they go out on, it's like St. George, it's an expeditionary spirit. right? It's sort of an aspect of this overking I talk about when it goes off and does something. So they're all connected. Gawain and Arthur are the same guy. They've inspirited Arthur. It's the young man going on initiation to become the king, because the king can't be both the hero and warrior at the same time. He can't be the guy that goes out, but he is as a whole, right? So everyone can't be a king, but it has these other constituent heroes that make up the king spirit, I suppose you could call it, right? A pantheon of our greatest heroes makes up a ethnos, right? A way of being. And you embody those different heroes when you go out and do these things. I think those way of beings, well, I think it's pretty clear actually from the research I've done, they're in being. That's why they keep coming out in this mythos, in Lord of the Rings, right? Because they're in Tolkien's being, they're in our being. It's not just passed from a story like a liberal would say. Again, this blank slate theory, you don't just read it in the story and then do it. It keeps emerging because it's in being. It's deeply nested in.
Yes.
In,
I agree. Yeah. Next super chat, BMX 1966, $20 says, this is great stuff. Thank you so much, BMX, longtime supporter, super chatter. Really appreciate all of the support. Again, guys, remember to go and subscribe to Scott over on his channel. The link is in the show description. I want to remind you guys, too, that the show sponsor is, as you know, Chalk.com. Chalk.com is the best sponsor out there other than Rockfin. Now, we have some new sponsors as well. Scott is also doing some great work, so we do a little bit of sponsoring from Scott has done a little bit of sponsoring. We have the sponsor Grand Theft World, Richard Grove, his geopolitical breakdowns and podcasts, the best for that kind of stuff. And when it comes to health, I want to recommend heading over to chalk.com and use the promo code J50 and get a hold of some of the Tonkat Ali. We live in a situation where our very biology is under attack, and that means that we're going to be soy boys. They want to make us into soy boys, and one of the things that you need to up is your testosterone, and so that you're not a soy boy. So head on over to chalk.com, use the promo code J50 to get 50% off the Tonkat Elite. There's also the Action 2.0. There's also the Shilajit. There's also the 7 Wonders. There's all kinds of products over there, and they're organized for guys and girls. And so if you're wondering what you need and you don't know, you can always pick the male or the female stack that they have over at chalk.com. John, for $1, do you have any thoughts on the pre-1066 existence of England? That is during the period of the Gregorian, Pope St. Gregory, the Augustine of Canterbury, King Ethelbert of Kent, Old English translations of Scripture, and this coming to an end with the death of King Harold Godwin's son. Now, I've read Bede and I've read Alfred. But beyond Bede and Alfred, I did have one class on early Anglo-Saxon literature where we went really deep into a lot of texts. But I do not know a lot of the history of this period other than some of the church stuff and some of the literature stuff. So I don't know if John's question, I'll give that to you, Scott, if you have any comments on pre-1066 England versus post.
Oh, well, look, one amazing thing, and this is what makes Alfred the Great true English, almost a Marcus Aurelius, is that who would have done this in this period? But he translated the Bible for the people. He said that what happened, you can think about where he was. There's this legend about Alfred the Great that he was, when they'd taken over everything, he was in Somerset, which was a swampland at the time, right? He had no men, and he was just cooking these cakes with an old woman. And he burnt the cakes, right? And she chastised him for it. And then he said, yes, that's my fault. That's my fault, those cakes that they burned, right? And this is a sort of low woman, right? A low peasant woman who are sort of gathered around Alfred. This is before he wins the resistance war, right? You see in that story a sort of realization of responsibility in that. I burnt the cakes. I think that's connected to this idea of when he translates the Bible later on, is that it's taking responsibility for everything that's happened rather than blaming something else, right? I think the Bible helps him do that. He takes it on himself and realizes, what did we do wrong? He says that what we did wrong was we thought that we were learned men. We thought that we would learn this Greek and this Latin, and that would be enough, and that would be it. But what we failed to realize is that everyone needed the Bible. Every able-bodied man in England needed this way of being within, right? So he translates it for every man. And he has there's this old Alfred jewel, which is called it's called the Alfred jewel, and it's got a pointer on it. It's a sort of think about it back then. This jewel was in every church with the Bible, the English translation of it. It says this must never be separated. And this is in his dictums of law, right? And so quite amazing. The king translates personally the Bible and has his men distribute it. So because that's the reason he believes that they failed against the Danes at that time, right? That we didn't have the divine wisdoms. He translates Boethius as well, the Consolations of Boethius, which I'm sure you know. These amazing books about deep wisdoms. And he says sense in, I translated sense for sense, which means he's bringing a deep Anglo-Saxon way into the translation of this stuff. It's not just it's bringing the ethnic element into it, which is the great translations do. It's a universal truth that is can never have the full universal truth, whatever, but it's a procedure to get to the universal truth, but you can never have it in the English Dasein, right? You can never have it in English being. It's there to use the rituals to get to, but you never capture it, because then profane would have it, right? So, but deeply needed for the people to have it, because if they had the wisdoms, then they could defeat the Danes, right? So I think there's a deep realization there in those translations, sending that around the kingdom, ordering all the priests to do it. That's the real start of that Christian kingdom, I think, that deep way of being, those translations. And that's, again, why he's that Marcus Aurelius figure. But I'm really he wasn't even known for a long period of time before they rediscovered him. But it is a shame that there is no book that had those tales that his mother was said to have told him. Yeah.
Yeah, so people were asking about that. Was because I was getting the link to the podcast from Richard. I just put the link in the chat there. So that's our show sponsor, Richard Grove over at Grand Theft World. And also here is the link to Scott's show, Scott's podcast over on Scott Mannion channel. So be sure and subscribe to him. And I hope you guys really enjoyed today's breakdown. I mean, it was pretty awesome. I was kind of blown away. Anytime that I can have somebody on and we can have a podcast where I learn things, that's my favorite. So, Scott, what do you want to get into as we close? Anything you want to leave us with? Parting thoughts, and then tell us about your channel again, because we had quite a few people that have just now hopped on. So we got up above 400. When you plug the channel, we only had about 200 people when we started. So tell us again about your channel, and what do you want to leave us with?
Well, I just want to say really deeply that I believe, and I think from all the evidence that I've gathered and all the deep work that I've done, is that this stuff is still deeply nested in American being, right? In the Anglo-Saxon way of being. It's a soul, a metaphysical soul. It does pass around. It's a hard thing to get, let's say, but it's still there. And great philosophers can be used to show that. You can use a bit of Jung. There's Dugan talks about this, right? It's this authentic truth of the way of being is embedded there. You can use cognitive science to talk about this. It's in procedural knowing, perspectival knowing that the propositions haven't got to, that you can call to. And this stuff is nested. That there was an old there's an old text that American wrote, which is an American's pilgrimage to England, which said, "We are the heirs of Runnymede, and Shakespeare's verse and Cromwell's deed, and nether earth shall part us." Right. So there is a descent there, but it makes no one person, because of their geography, is the supreme inheritor of this. You're not better because you come from England, right? So we have to nest ourselves in our historical, traditional being, or we're going to be pulled apart like grains of sand. That's what they want. So what do? We have to call to this traditional being to understand it, integrate deep levels of our being that are actually, with us. Like we said earlier in the conversation, it's an organism, this historical being that's in you as an organism. You have to integrate to understand your true, authentic history to lead a traditional life, right? Part of that's the Orthodox Church and such. Part of that is understanding your ethnic ground, and what are the ethnic grounds of the nation that you're in. You're not, I think people think, oh, we're disconnected now, it's not worth doing. But I don't know, from my experience, it's invigorating. It gives great vitality. And what my channel does is that. It's reconnecting it. It's reconnecting with the true being, though, and doing the deep work and using the mythos to do that rather than the propagandized historical texts, which are written by individuals. When you look to the mythos, because it's passed around with the folk, all the people in England and pubs, telling this, which means it absorbs it's more reliable because it's across all of being, right? It's across all of England, right? All these different people doing it, no intention. So it's implicit, think about it like a psychotechnology. It's implicitly benefiting people, but now we've stopped using it. So it's still connected to our procedural knowing and all that stuff, but we stopped using the folk tradition. stop using these things. So I do that. I look into our way of being, which is very deeply relevant to Americans. Look into our way of being. I have dissident dialogues as well. I talk to people like Jay because we have to bring a community together of our people, cross-promotional community, or we're going to get smashed by the algorithm. We have to do this. It's also great to be part of a community. So I do those, the dissident dialogues. But really, the deep work is that getting to our fundamental value hierarchy. And that's not as a proposition, though. Our values, as in the very archetypes, you could call them, or hyper agents that are there if you look for them. And that's it. That's basically what I do. But it's been an honor, dude. Thanks for inviting me on. The chat was great last time. That was posted on blogs and all sorts of things, and they said it really summed up your message that we had on our channel. So
yeah, thanks.
If you want to see
Absolutely.
Jay do a great one, go to the channel. Jay and my conversation is really good. Yeah.
I'll link that below our previous discussion in this show description as well when this gets done and we do when it gets processed. I want to remind you guys too that you can get my red book, which is 660 plus pages of all of my geopolitical, theological, and philosophical essays, and everything at the website is signed copies. You can also get the classics where I dive into the symbolism and the philosophy, the esoteric, all of that in Hollywood, parts 1 and 2, signed copies at the website. You can also get Jamie's books there as well as subscribing to the site in the members section. You can also subscribe to me on Rockfin as well. There's pros and cons to the website or Rockfin either way. But Scott, again, thank you so much. Great conversation, and look forward to future conversations with you as well.
God bless, man. Thank you so much.